Hi, I'm Penelope. When I was 28, my mother-in-law Vivienne looked me up and down in my law school graduation dress and sneered, "Oh good, finally someone qualified to be the help around here." She handed me dirty dishes at my own celebration dinner, while telling her country club friends I was just the girl who married her son for his trust fund. 12 years later, I walked into her hospital room as the youngest Chief Justice in Millbrook County history, and watched her face turn white when her doctor addressed me with the respect she never thought I deserved. Have you ever been treated like you were beneath someone, only to rise so high that they had to look up to see you? Before we dive deep, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? I want to know who else understands what it feels like to prove the doubters wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The memory of that graduation dinner still makes my hands shake sometimes. Not from fear anymore, but from the pure fury that kept me going through every late night, every bar exam study session, every moment when I wanted to give up. Vivienne Ashworth didn't just insult me that night in her sprawling Rosewood Heights mansion. She tried to erase 12 years of my life, 4 years of law school, and every dream I'd ever dared to whisper in the dark. I remember standing in her marble foyer, diploma still warm in my hands, wearing the navy blue dress I'd saved for 3 months to buy. My husband Nathaniel had his arm around my waist, pride radiating from him as he introduced me to his mother's dinner guests. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet my wife, Penelope. She just graduated summa cum laude from Grandview Law School." Vivienne's laugh was like broken glass scraping against concrete. She was elegant in that old money way, silver hair swept into a perfect chignon, pearls that probably cost more than my entire education, and eyes like winter mornings, beautiful and completely cold. She glided toward me in her champagne-colored silk dress, and for a moment, I thought she might actually congratulate me. Instead, she picked up a stack of crystal plates from the sideboard, each one probably worth more than my monthly rent, and placed them directly into my hands. The weight of them caught me off guard, and I fumbled slightly, the dishes clinking together with a sound that made everyone in the room turn to stare. "Oh, wonderful," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy women use when they want to cut you down while sounding gracious. "Finally, someone in this family who's qualified to be proper help around here." She gestured toward the dining room, where her guests, all perfectly coiffed women who probably spent more on their weekly manicures than I spent on groceries, were seated around her antique mahogany table. The ladies and I were just discussing how hard it is to find good domestic staff these days. The room went silent, except for the grandfather clock in the corner, its steady tick suddenly deafening. I felt Nathaniel's grip tighten on my waist, felt him start to speak, but Vivienne wasn't finished. "I mean, a degree from some little public law school is cute and all," she continued, taking a sip of her wine. "But let's be realistic about employment prospects, shall we? At least now you can make yourself useful while you figure out what you're actually going to do with your life." She turned to her friends with a conspiratorial smile. "Between you and me, I think she married Nathaniel for the trust fund. Smart girl, really. Much more practical than trying to actually practice law." The laughter that followed felt like acid in my ears. Not loud, cruel laughter, but that polite, knowing chuckle that rich people use when they think they're being clever. I stood there holding those damn plates, my diploma tucked under one arm, wearing my graduation dress that suddenly felt too cheap, too hopeful, too everything I shouldn't have been in that moment. I looked at Nathaniel, expecting him to defend me, to say something, anything, but he just squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Let's just get through dinner, Pen. You know how she is." That was the moment I realized I was completely alone. Not just in that mansion with its crystal chandeliers and imported marble, but in my marriage, in my new life, in everything I thought I was building. Vivienne had reduced me to nothing with a few sentences and a stack of dishes, and the man I loved had chosen to let it happen rather than fight for me. I carried those plates into the dining room, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors, each step echoing like a countdown. As I sat at the table, listening to the women discuss their charity galas and tennis tournaments, I made a promise to myself. A quiet, burning promise that would keep me awake for the next 12 years. I would never, ever be anyone's help again. I would rise so high that Vivienne Ashworth would have to crane her neck to see me. I would achieve something so undeniable, so impossible to dismiss, that her cruel laughter would die in her throat. I would become everything she said I'd never be, and more. Standing in that dining room, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from the tablecloth while her friends pretended I didn't exist, I whispered under my breath, "One day you'll regret this." I had no idea then that one day would come in a hospital room 12 years later, with life and death hanging in the balance, and the power to decide her fate literally in my hands. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand exactly how far I had to climb, and just how sweet justice tastes when it's served ice cold. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning after the graduation dinner, I woke up to the sound of rain pelting against the windows of our small apartment in Crescent Valley. The contrast between our cramped two-bedroom rental and Vivienne's mansion felt even sharper in the gray daylight. Nathaniel was already gone. He had an early meeting at his mother's investment firm, where he worked in a position she'd secured for him straight out of college. I lay in bed staring at my diploma, which I'd propped against the dresser mirror the night before. The gold seal seemed to mock me now, a worthless piece of paper that couldn't protect me from the venom in Vivienne's voice or the hollow feeling in my chest when my own husband chose silence over standing up for me. My phone buzzed with a text from my study group. Celebration brunch at Cafe Luna? We did it! For a moment I almost smiled. These were my people. First-generation college students, scholarship kids, night school warriors who understood what it meant to claw your way up from nothing. Then I remembered the dishes in my hands, Vivienne's laugh, and the way her friends looked through me like I was furniture. I got dressed in my best interview suit, navy blue, bought second-hand but tailored to fit perfectly, and drove to downtown Millbrook for my appointment at Hartwell & Associates. It was a small family law firm, nothing prestigious, but they were the only ones willing to give a Grandview Law graduate a chance. The bigger firms in Millbrook had connections to the old money families, the same circles where Vivienne ruled like an ice queen. The law office smelled like coffee and old books, a comforting contrast to the sterile perfection of the Ashworth mansion. Eleanor Hartwell, the senior partner, was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and gray hair she wore in a practical bob. She shook my hand firmly and gestured to a worn leather chair across from her desk. "I've reviewed your transcripts, Penelope. Impressive. Top 10% of your class, law review, and you worked full-time while in school?" She raised an eyebrow. "That takes serious dedication." For the first time in 24 hours, I felt like I could breathe. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell. I believe in earning what I achieve." "Good, because this job won't be easy. We handle family court cases, divorces, custody battles, protective orders. It's not glamorous work, and the pay is modest, but you'll get real courtroom experience from day one." I was about to respond when her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "I'm sorry, I need to take this. It's Judge Moreland's clerk." As she answered, I caught fragments of the conversation. "Emergency hearing, domestic violence case, need representation immediately." Eleanor hung up and looked at me with new intensity. "Penelope, how do you feel about starting right now? We have a woman who needs emergency representation for a protective order hearing in 2 hours. She's been severely beaten by her husband, and her previous attorney just had a family emergency." My heart pounded. I haven't even been sworn in yet. "I'll supervise, but I need someone who can think on their feet. The woman specifically asked for a female attorney. She's terrified and won't talk to men right now." Eleanor's eyes searched mine. "Are you ready to practice law, or do you need more time to ease into it?" I thought about Vivienne's sneer, about being dismissed as just the help, about Nathaniel's cowardice. I'm ready. 20 minutes later, I found myself in the county courthouse, following Eleanor through marble corridors that echoed with the click of our heels. The building was imposing, all dark wood and stern portraits of judges past, but instead of intimidating me, it felt like coming home. We met our client, Maria Santos, in a small conference room. She was maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back and a purple bruise covering half her face. Her left wrist was in a cast, and she flinched when anyone moved too quickly. But her eyes burned with the same determination I'd felt standing in Vivienne's dining room. "He said no one would believe me," Maria whispered, her voice hoarse. "He said I was nothing, that I'd never escape him because I don't have the money or the connections to fight back." I leaned forward, keeping my voice gentle but firm. "Maria, my name is Penelope Rivers, and I'm going to be your attorney today. I need you to know something. He's wrong. You do have someone to fight for you. You have me." The hearing was brutal. Maria's husband, Richard Santos, sat across the courtroom in an expensive suit with his high-powered attorney from Blackstone, Reed & Associates, one of those white shoe firms that represented people like Vivienne. They tried to paint Maria as an unstable gold digger who was making false accusations. But I'd done my homework in the hour we had to prepare. I had hospital records, police reports, photographs of Maria's injuries, and testimony from neighbors who'd heard the screaming. More importantly, I had Maria's courage. When I stood to address Judge Moreland, my voice didn't shake. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Mrs. Santos has endured systematic abuse for 3 years. She has documented medical evidence, witnesses, and the courage to speak her truth, despite threats to her safety. She deserves protection under the law, not persecution by expensive lawyers trying to silence her." Richard's attorney objected, arguing that Maria was emotionally unstable and, quote, "seeking financial gain." But as I presented each piece of evidence, methodically building the case for protection, I felt something click into place. This was what I was meant to do. Judge Moreland granted the protective order. As Maria broke down in tears of relief, hugging me with her good arm, I realized something profound had just happened. For the first time in my life, I had real power. Not the kind that came from money or family connections, but the power that came from knowledge, preparation, and the law itself. Walking out of that courthouse, I made a second promise to myself. I would master this system that protected people like Richard Santos and dismissed people like Maria and me. I would climb so high within it that no one, not Vivienne, not her country club friends, not anyone, could ever look down on me again. Eleanor patted my shoulder as we reached her car. "You did good work in there, Penelope. That woman is safe tonight because of you." But as we drove back to the office, I wasn't thinking about Maria's gratitude or Eleanor's praise. I was thinking about the moment when Judge Moreland had addressed me as Counselor Rivers, the respect in his voice, the way even Richard's expensive attorney had to listen when I spoke. I was thinking about power and how I was going to take it. The weeks following that first victory in court felt like living in 2 different worlds. During the day, I threw myself into my work at Hartwell & Associates with a hunger I'd never experienced before. Eleanor gave me case after case, restraining orders, custody disputes, divorce proceedings where women were fighting for their children and their dignity. Each courtroom appearance made me stronger, more confident, more certain that I'd found my calling. But the evenings were a different story entirely. Nathaniel would come home from his mother's investment firm, loosening his tie as he walked through our cramped apartment, and I could see the weight of Vivienne's expectations pressing down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. She called him every single day, sometimes twice, her voice carrying through our thin walls whenever he put her on speaker. "How is that little wife of yours adjusting to reality?" I'd hear her ask, the word wife dripping with disdain. I hope she's being more reasonable about her career expectations now. Nathaniel would glance at me nervously, then walk into the bedroom to finish the conversation, but I could still hear fragments. Mother, she's actually doing well, followed by Vivienne's sharp laugh and words I couldn't quite make out, though the tone was unmistakable. 3 weeks after my first case, Nathaniel came home with an announcement that made my stomach drop to the floor. Pen, we've been invited to the Rosewood Heights annual charity auction, he said, avoiding my eyes as he hung his jacket on the back of our kitchen chair. It's next Saturday. Mother thinks it would be good for us to attend together. I was standing at our tiny kitchen counter, eating leftover Chinese takeout straight from the container, because we still couldn't afford a full dining set. She thinks it would be good. What do you think, Nathaniel? He ran his hands through his sandy brown hair, a nervous habit he'd developed since we got married. She's trying, Pen. This is her way of including you in the family. Including me? The plastic fork snapped in my hand. Nathaniel. She handed me dirty dishes at my graduation dinner and called me the help. That's not inclusion. That's humiliation. Look, I know she was harsh, but… Harsh? I turned to face him fully, and something in my expression made him take a step back. She told her friends I married you for money. She dismissed 4 years of law school like it was a hobby. And you said nothing. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Outside our window, I could hear Mrs. Chen from next door practicing piano with her daughter, the halting notes of a Mozart sonata drifting through the thin walls. It was a sound that usually comforted me, but tonight it just emphasized how small our world was compared to Vivienne's sprawling mansion. She's my mother, Nathaniel finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I'm your wife. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or recognition. But then his phone buzzed with a text, and I watched him glance at it automatically. Vivienne's name lit up the screen. We should go, he said, not meeting my eyes. It's important for my career, for our future. Our future. I almost laughed at the bitter irony. There was no our future in Nathaniel's mind. There was only his mother's approval, and whatever scraps of dignity I could gather, while trying to fit into a world that had already decided I didn't belong. That Saturday evening, I stood in front of our bedroom mirror, smoothing down the black cocktail dress I'd bought for my law school formal 2 years earlier. It was the nicest thing I owned, but compared to what the women at Vivienne's charity auction would be wearing, it might as well have been a potato sack. The Rosewood Heights Country Club was a monument to old money, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers, with oil paintings of founding fathers staring down from gilded frames. As we walked through the entrance, I felt eyes turning toward us, conversations pausing just long enough for people to assess and categorize. Vivienne swept toward us in a floor-length emerald gown that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. Her smile was practiced perfection, the kind that photographers loved but never reached her eyes. Penelope, darling, she said, air-kissing both my cheeks while somehow managing not to actually touch me. How lovely that you could join us. I was just telling the Worthingtons about your little legal adventures. My spine stiffened. My legal work, you mean? Oh yes, of course. Vivienne's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. Nathaniel mentioned you're helping some unfortunate women with their domestic troubles. How? Charitable of you. The way she said charitable made it sound like a dirty word. Before I could respond, she linked her arm through Nathaniel's and began steering him toward a group of distinguished-looking men in expensive suits. Come, darling, I want you to meet Judge Pemberton. He's been asking about your prospects at the firm. I watched my husband disappear into the crowd, leaving me standing alone next to an ice sculpture of a swan that was slowly melting under the warm lights. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Excuse me, are you all right? I turned to find a woman about my age watching me with concerned eyes. She was elegant, but not ostentatious, wearing a simple navy dress and a warm smile that seemed genuine. "I'm fine," I said automatically, "just taking in the atmosphere." "It can be overwhelming, can't it?" She extended her hand. "I'm Dr. Rebecca Thorne. My husband dragged me to this thing. Apparently it's essential for building his practice." "Penelope Rivers. My mother-in-law dragged me here for similar reasons." Rebecca's eyes sparked with understanding. "Ah, the dreaded mother-in-law integration ritual. I went through that myself 3 years ago. Let me guess. You're being showcased like a prize heifer while simultaneously being reminded that you don't quite measure up?" For the first time all evening, I laughed. "That's remarkably accurate." "The trick," Rebecca said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "is to remember that their approval isn't actually required for your success. I learned that the hard way." As she spoke, I watched Vivienne across the room, holding court with her circle of friends while Nathaniel stood beside her like an obedient son. She was gesturing animatedly, probably telling another story about my humble origins or my cute little law practice. "What kind of doctor are you?" I asked Rebecca. "Emergency medicine. I work at Millbrook General." Her expression grew serious. "Actually, that's how I know your name. Eleanor Hartwell mentioned you when she brought Maria Santos to the hospital for documentation of her injuries. She said you were the one who made sure Maria got justice." Something warm spread through my chest. "You know about that case?" "Word travels fast in our circles. What you did, standing up to Richard Santos and his high-powered lawyers, that took real courage. Maria told everyone who would listen that you saved her life." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. For weeks I'd been doubting myself, wondering if Vivienne was right, if I was deluding myself about my capabilities. But here was someone who saw my work, really saw it, and recognized its value. "Thank you," I whispered. "I needed to hear that tonight." Rebecca squeezed my arm. "The women you're helping, they need someone like you. Someone who understands what it feels like to be underestimated, to have to fight for every ounce of respect." Across the room, Vivienne's laughter rang out, sharp and cutting. She was looking in my direction now, saying something to Judge Pemberton that made him nod sympathetically. I could imagine the conversation. Poor Nathaniel, married to someone so common. We're trying to help her understand her place. But for the first time, watching Vivienne perform for her audience, I didn't feel small. I felt something else entirely. A cold, burning determination that started in my chest and spread through my entire body. "Rebecca," I said quietly, "what would you say if I told you I plan to become a judge someday? Not just any judge, but the kind who could make real change." She studied my face for a long moment, then smiled. "I'd say that Millbrook County needs someone exactly like you on the bench, and I'd ask how I could help." As the evening wore on, I watched Vivienne work the room, secure in her belief that she controlled every narrative, every outcome. She had no idea that across the room, next to a melting ice sculpture, her daughter-in-law was making plans that would reshape everything she thought she knew about power. The real war was just beginning. 7 years passed like pages turning in a book I was writing myself, each chapter more powerful than the last. I barely recognized the woman I'd been at that charity auction, standing next to a melting ice sculpture while Vivienne dismissed my dreams as quote, little legal adventures. By 2019, I was no longer the uncertain young attorney clutching secondhand hope. I had become something Vivienne never saw coming, a force. My office at the Millbrook County District Attorney's headquarters occupied the entire corner of the 7th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of downtown. The morning sun streamed through the glass as I reviewed case files, my coffee growing cold in a mug that read Prosecutor of the Year 2018, an award that had made the front page of the Millbrook Tribune and, I was told, caused Vivienne to retreat to her bedroom for 2 days with a migraine. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After that charity auction, I'd made a decision that changed everything. I was going to stop playing defense and start playing offense. While Vivienne continued her social campaigns against me, I built something she couldn't touch, a reputation. 3 years after joining Hartwell and Associates, I'd prosecuted my first major case, a domestic violence scandal involving City Councilman James Hartford, who'd been beating his wife for years behind closed doors. The case made headlines when I proved that Hartford had been using his political connections to suppress police reports. His conviction launched my career into the stratosphere and earned me a job offer from District Attorney Patricia Winters. Penelope, DA Winters had said during our interview, "You have something rare in this profession. You're not afraid to go after powerful people when they deserve it." That's exactly what this office needs. She was right. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Vivienne, not of her social circle, not of anyone who thought they could intimidate me into silence. My rise through the DA's office was meteoric. I specialized in cases that other prosecutors wouldn't touch: corruption, abuse of power, crimes committed by people who thought their money or connections made them untouchable. Each victory was reported in the newspapers, each conviction another step up a ladder that Vivienne hadn't even realized existed. The irony was delicious. While she spent her days planning tea parties and charity galas, I was becoming one of the most powerful women in Millbrook County. While she gossiped about my common background, judges were seeking my counsel on complex legal matters. While she dismissed me as that girl who married Nathaniel for his trust fund, I was earning more money than her son ever would at his mother's investment firm. Nathaniel and I had divorced 4 years earlier, a decision that surprised no one except him. The papers cited irreconcilable differences, but the truth was simpler. I had outgrown him. The final straw came when he asked me to turn down a high-profile corruption case because it might, quote, embarrass mother's friends. "I'm not turning down anything for your mother ever again," I told him as I signed the divorce papers, "and neither should you." He'd kept the apartment. I didn't want anything that reminded me of feeling small. Instead, I bought a sleek downtown condo with my prosecutor's salary and the settlement from a lawsuit I'd won against a pharmaceutical company. The view from my living room encompassed the entire Rosewood Heights neighborhood, including Vivienne's mansion. Every morning, I could literally look down on the woman who'd once looked down on me. But the real satisfaction came from watching her social standing crumble as her friends began to realize that knowing me, really knowing me, was more valuable than her approval. Judge Moreland, who'd presided over my first case with Maria Santos, now called me directly when he needed legal opinions. The mayor sought my endorsement during elections. Even some of Vivienne's country club friends had started inviting me to their events, eager to be associated with the woman who'd just convicted the previous police chief of embezzlement. Rebecca Thorne had become my closest friend and most trusted advisor. Now the head of emergency medicine at Millbrook General, she'd introduced me to circles of influence that Vivienne had never imagined existed, professional women who'd built their power through competence rather than inheritance. "You know what the best part is?" Rebecca said one evening as we shared wine on my condo balcony, the lights of Rosewood Heights twinkling below us. "She still doesn't understand what's happening. She thinks your success is temporary, some kind of fluke." I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the liquid catch the light. Let her think that. The higher I climb, the further she has to fall when she finally realizes the truth. That truth was becoming harder for Vivienne to ignore. 2 months earlier, I'd received an invitation that would have been unthinkable 7 years ago. Governor Patricia Langston wanted to meet with me about future opportunities in public service. The meeting had led to another invitation, this one to speak at the annual State Bar Association convention about reforming the criminal justice system. My speech had been live-streamed, watched by thousands of attorneys across the state. I'd spoken about the importance of holding powerful people accountable, about ensuring that justice wasn't determined by wealth or social connections. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, and my phone had been ringing non-stop ever since with job offers from major law firms and government positions. But I wasn't interested in private practice or climbing someone else's ladder anymore. I had my sights set on something bigger, something that would make Vivienne's social games look like children playing dress-up. 3 weeks after the convention, I received a call that made my hands shake. Not with fear this time, but with anticipation. "Ms. Rivers? This is Chief Justice Hamilton's office. The Chief Justice would like to schedule a meeting with you regarding an upcoming vacancy on the State Appellate Court." I had to sit down. A judgeship. An actual judgeship. "I'm available at his convenience," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. After I hung up, I walked to my office window and looked out at the city I'd conquered case by case, conviction by conviction. Somewhere out there, in her mansion filled with antiques and empty achievements, Vivienne was probably planning another charity event, completely oblivious to the fact that her former daughter-in-law was about to become one of the most powerful judicial figures in the state. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a photo I'd saved from that night 7 years ago, a picture Rebecca had taken of me at the charity auction, standing alone next to the melting ice sculpture while Vivienne held court across the room. In the photo, I looked lost, overwhelmed, like a woman who didn't belong. Now I could barely recognize that person. The woman reflected in my office window was someone else entirely. Shoulders back, chin raised, eyes that no longer asked for permission or approval. Someone who'd learned that power wasn't inherited or gifted. It was taken, piece by piece, victory by victory. My assistant knocked on the door, interrupting my thoughts. "Ms. Rivers, you have that meeting with the Rodriguez family in 10 minutes. The corruption case against the school board?" "Thank you, Jennifer. Send them in." As I straightened my blazer and prepared to meet with another family seeking justice against a system that had failed them, I thought about the promise I'd made to myself that night at the charity auction. I'd vowed to become someone Vivienne couldn't dismiss, someone who commanded respect rather than begging for it. Mission accomplished. But I wasn't finished yet. The best part, the part that would make all those years of condescension and cruelty worth it, was still to come. Because in 3 days, I would be sitting across a conference table from Chief Justice Hamilton, discussing my qualifications for a position that would put me permanently beyond Vivienne's reach. And she wouldn't even know it was happening until she read about it in the newspapers. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing appellate briefs for my upcoming confirmation hearing. 3 months had passed since my meeting with Chief Justice Hamilton, and the judicial appointment process was moving forward smoothly. The State Judicial Nominating Commission had recommended me unanimously, and the governor's approval was expected within weeks. I should have been focused entirely on preparing for my new role as an appellate court judge, but the voice on the other end of the phone made my blood run cold. "Ms. Rivers, this is Dr. Amanda Sterling from Millbrook General Hospital. I'm calling about Vivienne Ashworth. You're listed as her emergency contact." The irony hit me like a physical blow. After all these years of hatred and dismissal, somehow I was still connected to her in the system, probably a relic from my marriage to Nathaniel that no one had bothered to update. "I think there's been a mistake," I said, setting down my coffee cup with trembling fingers. "I'm her former daughter-in-law. We haven't spoken in years." "I understand, but you're the only contact we have. Mrs. Ashworth was brought in this morning after collapsing at her home. She suffered a severe stroke, and we need someone to make medical decisions. Her son Nathaniel appears to be unreachable. We've tried calling multiple numbers." Of course, Nathaniel was unreachable. After our divorce, he'd spiraled into a pattern of expensive rehabilitation centers and extended spiritual journeys funded by his trust fund. Vivienne had spent the last few years covering up his increasingly erratic behavior while maintaining the fiction that he was finding himself in Europe. What kind of decisions?" I asked, my prosecutor's mind automatically shifting into crisis mode even as my emotions reeled. "She's unconscious and on life support. The next 24 hours are critical. We need consent for emergency procedures and potentially end-of-life decisions if her condition doesn't improve." I closed my eyes, seeing Vivienne as she'd been at that charity auction, imperious, cruel, absolutely certain of her superiority. Now she was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, and the woman she'd dismissed as the help was the only person standing between her and whatever came next. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to Millbrook General felt surreal, like traveling through a landscape that kept shifting between past and present. I found myself remembering fragments of conversations, moments when Vivienne's cruelty had cut so deep I'd wondered if I'd ever recover. But I also remembered the woman behind the cruelty, someone so terrified of losing control that she'd turned love into a weapon and kindness into a vulnerability. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and quiet desperation. Dr. Sterling met me at the nurses' station, a woman about my age with tired eyes and the kind of competent demeanor that reminded me of Rebecca. "Mrs. Ashworth's condition is extremely serious," she explained as we walked toward Vivienne's room. "The stroke has affected multiple areas of her brain. Even if she survives, there's likely to be significant impairment, speech, mobility, possibly cognitive function." She paused outside room 314. "I have to ask, what's your relationship with the patient? The decisions we're discussing are typically made by immediate family." I looked through the glass window at the figure on the bed, so small and vulnerable, surrounded by machines and tubes. This wasn't the formidable woman who'd terrorized me for years. This was just someone's mother, someone's grandmother, reduced to the most basic fight for survival. "We have complicated history," I said finally, "but right now I'm the only person here for her." Dr. Sterling nodded with the understanding of someone who'd seen every possible family dynamic play out in hospital corridors. "The legal paperwork can be sorted out later. Right now she needs advocates, not bureaucracy." As I entered the room, the steady beeping of monitors created a rhythm that seemed to count down the seconds of Vivienne's life. She looked impossibly fragile, her silver hair spread across the pillow, her face relaxed in a way I'd never seen. Without the armor of makeup and perfectly coordinated outfits, without the sharp intelligence that she'd wielded like a sword, she was just a 72-year-old woman fighting for her next breath. I pulled a chair beside her bed and sat down, studying her face for traces of the woman who'd shaped so much of my adult life through her rejection and cruelty. But mostly, I felt something I hadn't expected. A profound sadness for all the years we'd wasted as enemies when we might have been allies. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Just heard about Vivienne, do you need anything?" I typed back, "Just time to think." But thinking was exactly what I couldn't afford to do. Every few minutes, Dr. Sterling or one of the nurses would appear with questions that required immediate answers. Did I want them to continue aggressive treatment? Should they attempt another surgery to relieve pressure on her brain? What were Vivienne's wishes regarding life support? The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd spent years telling me I wasn't good enough to make decisions about anything was now entirely dependent on my judgment. I held her life in my hands the same way she'd once held my dignity, completely and without her consent. Around noon, Dr. Sterling returned with news that made my stomach drop. "We've managed to reduce some of the swelling, but there's been another complication. She's developed a blood clot that could cause another stroke at any moment. We can attempt surgery to remove it, but it's extremely risky given her condition." "What are the odds?" "Without surgery, she'll likely die within hours. With surgery, maybe 30% chance of survival. And even then, significant brain damage is almost certain." I stared at Vivienne's peaceful face, remembering the last words she'd spoken to me directly. It had been at the grocery store 2 years earlier, an accidental encounter in the produce section. She'd looked at me with those cold eyes and said, "I hope you're satisfied with yourself, destroying my family." Then she'd walked away, leaving me standing there with a cart full of vegetables and a heart full of old wounds. Now I had the power to give her a fighting chance or to let nature take its course. The woman who'd never shown me mercy was entirely at my mercy. My phone rang, an unknown number with a European country code. Penelope? Nathaniel's voice was thick with what sounded like alcohol or medication. I just got the message about Mother. They said you're making decisions? Where are you, Nathaniel? Switzerland. I'm in a treatment center. I can't just leave. Your mother is dying. The silence stretched across continents. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, younger, like the man I'd once loved before Vivienne's poison had infected everything between us. What did the doctors say? I explained the situation, the surgery, the risks, the probable outcomes. As I talked, I watched Vivienne's chest rise and fall with mechanical precision, each breath a gift from the machines surrounding her. I can't make this decision, Nathaniel whispered. I've never been able to make the hard decisions. That's why she always... He trailed off, but I knew what he meant. That's why she always controlled everything, everyone, every outcome. Then I'll make it, I said quietly. After I hung up, I sat in the gathering afternoon light, watching shadows move across Vivienne's face. Outside the window, Millbrook was going about its business. People working, shopping, living their lives, without knowing that in room 314, the future was being decided by two women who'd been locked in battle for over a decade. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway. Ms. Rivers, we need a decision. I looked at Vivienne one more time, this woman who'd tried to destroy me and had instead forged me into something stronger than either of us had imagined possible. In 3 weeks, I would be sworn in as an appellate court judge. In 5 years, if my plans unfolded correctly, I could be Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. I would have power that Vivienne had never dreamed of, influence that stretched far beyond her social circles. None of that would mean anything if I let her die out of spite. Schedule the surgery, I said. Do everything you can to save her. Dr. Sterling nodded and disappeared. As the medical team prepared for the operation that would determine Vivienne's fate, I made another call, this one to the one person who would understand the weight of this moment. Rebecca, it's me. I need you to do something. Can you make sure the best neurosurgeon in the state is available for a consultation? Money is no object. Of course. But Pen, are you sure about this? I looked at Vivienne's face, peaceful in a way it had never been in consciousness, and felt a strange sort of closure settling over me. I'm sure. When this is over, when she wakes up and realizes what happened, I want her to understand something. I want her to know that the woman she called the help saved her life. The surgery lasted 8 hours. I spent most of that time in the hospital's law library. Yes, Millbrook General had a small legal research facility for medical malpractice cases, diving into something I'd been avoiding for years, the complete truth about Vivienne Ashworth. While neurosurgeon Dr. Marcus Chen worked to save her life, I systematically dismantled the mythology she'd built around herself and her family. What I discovered in those quiet hours, surrounded by medical journals and legal databases, changed everything I thought I knew about the woman who'd tormented me. The first revelation came through property records. The Ashworth mansion that had intimidated me so much during my marriage, the symbol of old money and established power, had been purchased just 18 months before Nathaniel and I met. Before that, Vivienne had been living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Riverside Gardens, a middle-class neighborhood on the other side of town. I pulled up more records, my prosecutor's instincts fully engaged now. Vivienne Rose Murphy, her maiden name, had grown up in the same kind of working-class family I had. Her father was a mechanic, her mother a seamstress. She'd attended public schools, worked as a secretary at an insurance company, and married Nathaniel's father, William Ashworth, when she was 28 years old. William had been 55, recently divorced, and desperate for someone to help raise his 8-year-old son. According to the marriage certificate, Vivienne had taken his name and his money, but she'd also taken on something else, the burden of pretending to be someone she'd never been. The financial records painted an even more complex picture. William Ashworth had been wealthy, but not as wealthy as Vivienne had led everyone to believe. Most of his assets had been tied up in a failing manufacturing business that had collapsed shortly after their marriage. The insurance settlement from William's sudden death 5 years later had provided the down payment for the mansion, but the monthly payments had nearly bankrupted her. I found court documents showing that Vivienne had been one lawsuit away from losing everything when Nathaniel turned 21 and gained access to his trust fund. Her treatment of me, her desperate need to control her son's marriage, suddenly made a different kind of sense. She hadn't been protecting old money from new. She'd been protecting a carefully constructed lie from someone who might expose it. My phone buzzed with an update from Dr. Chen. Surgery successful. Patient stable but critical. Will know more in 24 to 48 hours. I saved my research and went to check on Vivienne. She was back in the ICU, looking even smaller than before, surrounded by more machines but breathing on her own. The nurse, a kind woman named Linda, who'd been updating me throughout the day, showed me the latest brain scans. The surgery removed the clot successfully, she explained in hushed tones. There's still significant damage, but Dr. Chen is cautiously optimistic about her chances for survival. Cognitive function is still unknown. I sat beside Vivienne's bed again, studying her face with new understanding. The woman who'd made me feel small and common had been fighting the same battle I was, trying to prove she belonged in a world that had been closed to her. The difference was that she'd chosen deception, while I'd chosen determination. Over the next 2 days, while Vivienne drifted in and out of consciousness, I continued my investigation. I called in favors from contacts at newspapers, court clerks, and public records offices. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd spent 30 years living in terror that someone would discover her truth. The charity work that had seemed so genuine? Tax records showed that most of the donations had gone to administrative costs, primarily maintaining her lifestyle and social standing. The investment firm where she'd secured Nathaniel a position? It was bleeding money, propped up only by her son's trust fund contributions and her ability to attract investors through her social connections. Most damning of all, I found evidence that Vivienne had been systematically draining Nathaniel's inheritance to maintain their lifestyle. Bank records showed regular transfers from his accounts to hers, justified as, quote, family expenses and investment opportunities that never materialized. She'd been stealing from her own son to fund the performance of wealth that kept her world intact. On Thursday evening, Rebecca joined me in the ICU waiting room with coffee and Chinese takeout. "You look like hell," she said, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside me. "When's the last time you went home?" "Monday night, I think." "Rebecca, I need to tell you something. About Vivienne, about all of this." I explained what I'd discovered, the working-class background, the financial desperation, the systematic deception that had defined Vivienne's adult life. Rebecca listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped me process what I'd learned. "So she wasn't the blue-blood aristocrat she pretended to be," Rebecca said finally. "She was just like you, someone trying to climb up from nothing. Except she chose to pull the ladder up behind her instead of helping others climb it too." "That's the difference between you two," Rebecca agreed. "But Pen, this changes things, doesn't it? Now that you know her story?" I looked through the glass at Vivienne, still unconscious but stable. The monitors showed steady vital signs, suggesting that her body was fighting to recover, even if her mind remained locked away. "I keep thinking about something," I said slowly. "When I was researching her background, I found a newspaper clipping from 1987. It was about William Ashworth's wedding to, quote, local secretary Vivienne Murphy. The description of her in that article, it could have been written about me 15 years ago. A bright young woman from humble beginnings who's worked hard to build a better life." "What happened to her?" Rebecca asked. "What turned that bright young woman into someone who'd treat you the way she did?" That was the question that had been haunting me for 2 days. Somewhere along the way, Vivienne had made a choice that I'd refused to make. She'd decided that lifting herself up required pushing others down, that her security depended on making others feel insecure. Friday morning brought news that changed everything again. Dr. Chen found me in the cafeteria, his expression cautiously optimistic. "She's awake," he said. "Groggy and confused, but awake. Her speech is somewhat impaired, but she's asking for someone named Nathaniel." My stomach tightened. What about cognitive function? Too early to tell definitively, but her responses suggest significant memory retention. She knows who she is, where she is. The next few days will tell us more about what kind of recovery we can expect. I followed Dr. Chen back to the ICU, my heart pounding with an anxiety I couldn't quite name. Through the glass, I could see Vivienne's eyes were open, tracking the movement of nurses around her bed. When she saw me approaching, her expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been recognition. The nurse stepped aside as I entered the room. Vivienne's eyes followed me, and I could see her struggling to form words. When she finally spoke, her voice was weak and slurred, but the words were clear enough. "Why are you here?" I pulled the chair closer to her bed, close enough that she could see my face clearly, despite whatever visual impairment the stroke might have caused. "You had a stroke, Vivienne, 3 days ago. You've been unconscious since the surgery." She blinked slowly, processing this information. "Nathaniel? He's in Switzerland, at a treatment center. He couldn't come." The flash of pain that crossed her face had nothing to do with her medical condition. For a moment, she looked exactly like what she was, an abandoned mother whose son had chosen addiction and distance over dealing with the complexity of their relationship. "You stayed?" she asked, the question barely audible. "Someone had to make the medical decisions. I was your emergency contact." She closed her eyes, and I thought she might have drifted back to sleep. But then she opened them again, and this time there was something different in her gaze. Not the coldness I remembered, but a kind of bewildered vulnerability. "Why?" she whispered. It was such a simple question, but it contained multitudes. Why had I stayed? Why had I authorized the surgery? Why was I sitting beside her bed when we'd been enemies for over a decade? "Because," I said quietly, "someone needed to be here for you. And despite everything between us, no one deserves to face this alone." Vivienne stared at me for a long moment, tears gathering in her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was so soft I had to lean forward to hear her. "I know what I did to you." The monitors continued their steady beeping, marking time in a conversation that should have happened years ago. Outside the window, Millbrook was waking up to another day, oblivious to the reckoning taking place in room 314. "Yes," I said simply, "you do." Vivienne's recovery progressed slowly over the next 2 weeks. The stroke had left her with weakness on her left side and a slight speech impediment, but her mind remained sharp, perhaps too sharp for her own comfort. As her physical condition stabilized, she began to grasp the full implications of her situation, her secrets exposed, her son absent, and her former victim now holding all the cards. I visited every day, partly out of obligation and partly out of fascination. Watching Vivienne without her armor of wealth and social position was like observing a masterclass in human psychology. She was still calculating, still strategic, but now those skills were focused on survival rather than dominance. On a Thursday afternoon, I arrived to find her propped up in bed, wearing her own silk pajamas instead of hospital gowns, a small assertion of dignity that spoke volumes about her determination to maintain some semblance of control. "The nurses tell me you've been paying for a private room," she said without preamble, her speech clearer than it had been the previous week, "and arranging for additional physical therapy sessions." I settled into the chair that had become mine by default. The insurance only covered basic care. "I thought you deserved better." "Why?" The question she'd asked repeatedly over the past 2 weeks, each time with growing intensity. Because despite everything you did to me, no one should have to recover from a stroke in a shared room with inadequate rehabilitation services. She studied my face with eyes that were still piercingly intelligent despite her physical limitations. You could have let me die. Yes. You could have chosen the minimal care and let whatever happened happen. Yes. But instead you're spending, tens of thousands of dollars to ensure I get the best possible treatment. Money I can afford now, I said quietly. Thanks to the career you once dismissed as impossible. That landed like a physical blow. Vivienne's face crumpled slightly before she regained her composure, but I'd seen the impact. For the first time in our relationship, she was truly hearing me, not dismissing, not deflecting, but actually listening to the words I was saying. Penelope, she said, my name coming out carefully, as if she were testing how it sounded when spoken with respect instead of disdain. I need to tell you something. About the money. I know about the money. Her eyes widened slightly. What do you know? I know about your father, the mechanic, and your mother, the seamstress. I know about the apartment in Riverside Gardens, and the insurance settlement that bought the mansion. I know about the failing business and the loans against Nathaniel's trust fund. Vivienne's face went ashen. How? I'm a prosecutor, Vivienne. Research is what I do. I leaned forward slightly. I know that you weren't born into the world you claimed to rule. You climbed into it, just like I did. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the steady hum of medical equipment. When Vivienne finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Then you know why I couldn't let you succeed. No, I don't. Explain it to me. She turned her head to stare out the window at the city beyond. When William died, I was terrified. Not just of losing the money, but of losing everything I'd worked to become. I'd spent 15 years learning to speak properly, to dress appropriately, to navigate their social rules. I'd erased Vivienne Murphy so completely that sometimes I forgot she'd ever existed. Her hand moved restlessly on the hospital blanket. Then Nathaniel brought you home, and you were everything I'd been before I reinvented myself. Smart, determined, ambitious, but from nowhere, with nothing. And I looked at you and saw my old self, the one I'd buried so deep I thought no one would ever find her. So you tried to destroy me to protect your secret. I tried to destroy you because you reminded me of what I'd given up to get where I was. Tears were gathering in her eyes. When I was young, when I was Vivienne Murphy, I wanted to help people too. I wanted to be a teacher, maybe work with children who came from backgrounds like mine. But William needed a wife who could help him socially, professionally. So I became what he needed instead of what I wanted to be. The confession hung in the air like a challenge. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation, for the calculated performance I'd learned to expect from her. But what I saw was something I'd never witnessed before, genuine remorse. You could have mentored me, I said. You could have been proud that your son chose someone who shared your real values, your actual background. Instead, you made me your enemy. I was afraid, she said simply. Afraid that if you succeeded, people would start asking questions about why Nathaniel's wife was so much more accomplished than his mother. Afraid that someone would dig into my past the way you apparently did. Afraid that everything I'd built would collapse. So you decided to tear me down instead. I decided to protect myself. She turned back to meet my eyes. It was selfish and cruel, and I've regretted it every day since your divorce. Watching Nathaniel spiral into addiction and therapy while you became everything I'd once dreamed of being. It's been its own kind of punishment. I absorbed this, feeling some of the anger I'd carried for over a decade begin to shift into something more complex. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. There's something else you need to know, I said quietly. Something that's going to be announced next week. Vivienne's expression grew cautious. What? Governor Langston is appointing me to the state appellate court. I'll be sworn in as Judge Rivers next month. The impact was immediate and profound. Vivienne's face went through a series of expressions. Shock, disbelief, and then something that might have been pride warring with dismay. "Judge Rivers," she repeated, testing the words. "You're going to be a judge." "Yes, and there's more." I paused, watching her face carefully. "Chief Justice Hamilton is retiring in 2 years. The governor has already indicated that she's considering me as a potential replacement. If that happens, I'll be the youngest Chief Justice in the state's history." Vivienne closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were filled with tears. "You're going to be Chief Justice." "Possibly." "The woman I called the help is going to be the most powerful judge in the state." Ironic, isn't it? She was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what I'd just told her. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "What are you going to do with that power?" It was the question I'd been expecting, the one that cut to the heart of why I was telling her this. I could have waited until the announcement was public, could have let her read about it in the newspapers like everyone else. But I wanted her to hear it from me, wanted to see her face when she realized the full scope of what she'd unleashed when she tried to diminish me. "I'm going to use it to help people like Maria Santos," I said. "People who've been dismissed and underestimated, who need someone in power to remember what it feels like to have none." "And people like me?" The question hung between us, loaded with decades of pain and resentment. I could have destroyed her with my answer, could have promised retribution for every cruel word and dismissive gesture. Instead, I chose something more powerful. "People like you, people who've forgotten who they used to be, I'm going to try to remind them that it's never too late to remember." Vivienne began to cry then, not the delicate tears of someone trying to maintain dignity, but the raw, broken sobs of someone finally confronting the cost of their choices. I didn't try to comfort her, didn't offer false reassurances. I simply sat with her while she grieved for the woman she'd been, and the relationship we might have had if fear hadn't made her cruel. When the tears finally subsided, she looked at me with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in years. "I don't deserve your kindness," she said. "No," I agreed, "you don't. But I'm not being kind for your sake, I'm being kind for mine." The next morning, I walked into my office at the DA's headquarters, knowing that everything was about to change. My assistant Jennifer greeted me with excitement barely contained. "Ms. Rivers," the governor's office called, "the announcement is scheduled for this afternoon. Are you ready?" I looked out my window at the city that would soon know my new title, at the courthouse where I'd fought my first case, at the distant mansion where Vivienne was probably watching the news, and finally understanding that the war between us was over, not because I'd destroyed her, but because I'd risen so far above our conflict that it no longer mattered. "Yes," I said, straightening my blazer and preparing for the press conference that would change my life forever. "I'm ready." The announcement of my judicial appointment hit Millbrook society like a seismic event. By evening, my phone was buzzing with congratulations from colleagues, reporters requesting interviews, and old law school friends expressing their amazement. But it was the silence from certain quarters that told the real story. Within 48 hours, the pushback began. It started subtly, as these things always do in polite society. Whispered conversations at country club lunches about whether I was really qualified for such a prestigious position. Questions raised about my limited experience compared to other candidates who'd been practicing law for decades longer. Concerns about my agenda and whether someone from my background could truly understand the complexities of appellate law. The first public salvo came from an unexpected source, District Attorney Patricia Winters, my own boss and former mentor. "While we congratulate Judge-elect Rivers on her appointment," she told the Millbrook Tribune, "we have serious concerns about losing such a valuable prosecutor to the bench at this critical time. Her departure leaves significant gaps in our ongoing corruption investigations." The quote was carefully crafted to sound supportive, while planting seeds of doubt about the timing and wisdom of my appointment. I recognized Patricia's political maneuvering. She'd been passed over for a federal judgeship the previous year, and wasn't above sabotaging others to advance her own interests. But the real orchestrated campaign against me became clear when Rebecca called me at home Thursday evening, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Pen, you need to see tomorrow's Tribune. Someone's been talking to reporters about your personal life." The article, published under the byline of veteran reporter Marcus Webb, was titled, "From Divorce Court to Appeals Court, Questions About Judge-Elect's Character." It detailed my marriage to Nathaniel, our divorce, and included unnamed sources questioning whether someone who, quote, couldn't maintain a stable marriage should be making decisions about family law cases. More damaging were the financial implications. The article suggested that my ability to pay for Vivienne's private medical care raised questions about my income sources, hinting at possible corruption or undisclosed financial arrangements. It was a masterful piece of character assassination, using truth as a weapon while avoiding any claims so specific they could be legally challenged. I knew immediately who was behind it. This had Vivienne's fingerprints all over it. Not the broken woman recovering from a stroke, but the network of social connections she'd spent 30 years cultivating. Her friends, her allies, the people who'd benefited from her charity events and social introductions. They were protecting their investment in her version of reality by destroying mine. The phone call that confirmed my suspicions came Friday morning. It was from State Senator Caroline Blackwood, chair of the Judicial Confirmation Committee. "Penelope, I wanted to give you a heads up. We've received several calls expressing concerns about your appointment. Nothing formal yet, but there's talk of requesting additional hearings." "What kind of concerns?" "Questions about your experience, your financial situation, your personal judgment. The usual political theater, but with enough substance that we can't ignore it completely." I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with being under attack. "Senator, my record speaks for itself. I've prosecuted more high-profile corruption cases than any attorney in this district's history. My financial disclosures are complete and accurate, and my personal life has no bearing on my qualifications for the bench." "I agree completely," Senator Blackwood said. "But perception matters in politics. And right now, some very influential people are working to shape the perception that you're not ready for this responsibility." After I hung up, I sat in my office staring out at the city that had become my battlefield. Every victory I'd achieved, every case I'd won, every step up the ladder, it all came down to this moment. They were trying to do to me what Vivienne had attempted 12 years earlier: reduce me to nothing, make me question my own worth, force me to retreat. The difference was that I wasn't that uncertain young attorney anymore. I was a prosecutor who'd taken down corrupt politicians, abusive police officers, and white-collar criminals who thought their connections made them untouchable. If they wanted a fight, I was more than ready to give them one. I started by calling Governor Langston's office directly. "Governor, I need to speak with you about the campaign against my appointment." "I've been expecting this call," she said. "My staff has been monitoring the situation. How do you want to handle it?" "I want to fight back. But I need to know, do I have your full support? Or are you looking for a reason to withdraw my nomination?" Governor Langston's laugh was sharp and decisive. "Penelope, do you think I appointed you because you were the safe choice? I appointed you because you're the right choice, and because you've never backed down from a fight when justice was on the line. That hasn't changed. Then I need access to my personnel files from the DA's office and permission to release my complete financial records. I want everything transparent." "Done. What else?" "I want to hold a press conference. Let me address these allegations directly, instead of letting them fester in whisper campaigns." The press conference was scheduled for Monday morning in the courthouse steps, symbolic territory that reinforced my connection to the legal system I'd served faithfully for over a decade. I spent the weekend preparing, reviewing every case I'd prosecuted, every financial transaction I'd made, every decision that had led me to this moment. Rebecca helped me choose my outfit, a navy blue suit that conveyed authority without ostentation, Minimal jewelry, except for a small pin that had belonged to my grandmother, a reminder of where I'd come from and how far I'd traveled. The assembled reporters filled the courthouse plaza, cameras focused on the podium, where I would either save my appointment or watch it die under the weight of manufactured scandal. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying clearly in the crisp autumn air. "I'm here to address the questions that have been raised about my qualifications and character since Governor Langston announced my appointment to the state appellate court." I spoke for 20 minutes, methodically dismantling each allegation while reinforcing my record of public service. I released my financial statements, showing that my ability to pay for Vivienne's medical care came from legitimate income and careful savings. I detailed my prosecution record, including cases where I'd taken on powerful defendants despite political pressure to back down. But it was my closing statement that cut through the political noise and reminded everyone why I'd been chosen for this position. 12 years ago, I walked into a courtroom for the first time to represent a woman named Maria Santos, who needed protection from an abusive husband. I was nervous, inexperienced, and completely outmatched by the expensive lawyers on the other side. But I had something they didn't: the absolute certainty that justice mattered more than politics, more than social connections, more than preserving comfortable lives. I paused, scanning the faces in the crowd, knowing that some of them were allies and others were enemies, but all of them were listening. The people attacking my appointment aren't questioning my qualifications. They're afraid of them. They're afraid of a judge who remembers what it feels like to be powerless, who won't be intimidated by wealth or influence, who believes that the law should protect everyone equally. That's exactly the kind of judge this state needs, and that's exactly the kind of judge I intend to be. The questions that followed were sharp, but not hostile. I answered each one directly, refusing to be defensive while making it clear that I wouldn't be intimidated into withdrawal. As I walked back into the courthouse after the press conference, my phone was already buzzing with messages of support. Editorial boards were calling for statements, bar associations were issuing endorsements, and legal aid organizations were organizing letter-writing campaigns. But the most meaningful message came from an unexpected source. It was a text from a number I recognized as belonging to Vivienne's hospital room, watching the news. "You were magnificent. Magus V." I stared at the message for a long moment, understanding its significance. For the first time since I'd known her, Vivienne was publicly acknowledging my strength instead of trying to undermine it. Whatever forces were working against me, they weren't coming from the woman who'd once been my greatest enemy. That evening, I received a call that changed everything again. "Ms. Rivers, this is Chief Justice Hamilton. I've been watching the response to your press conference with great interest. I wonder if you might join me for dinner tomorrow evening. There are some things we need to discuss about your future on the court." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the pushback against my appointment had accomplished something its architects never intended. It had forced me to articulate exactly why I deserved this position and reminded everyone, including myself, that I'd never backed down from a fight when the stakes mattered. They'd tried to diminish me, just like Vivienne had 12 years earlier, and just like 12 years earlier, they'd only made me stronger. Chief Justice Hamilton's townhouse in the historic Beacon Hill district felt like stepping into a legal museum. The walls were lined with leather-bound volumes of court decisions, portraits of distinguished jurists, and memorabilia from a career spanning 4 decades on the bench. But it was the warmth in Justice Hamilton's eyes when she greeted me at the door that made the formal setting feel welcoming. "Penelope, thank you for coming. I hope you don't mind that I ask you here rather than to my office. Some conversations are better held away from the courthouse walls." Justice Hamilton was a legend in legal circles, the first woman appointed to the state Supreme Court, a brilliant jurist who'd written opinions that shaped civil rights law for generations. At 71, she moved with the graceful confidence of someone who'd spent her career breaking barriers while maintaining absolute dignity. Over dinner, we discussed everything except the obvious reason for our meeting. She asked about my background, my philosophy on jurisprudence, my thoughts on the role of appellate courts in shaping social policy. It felt less like an interview and more like a masterclass, with Justice Hamilton sharing insights gained from decades of navigating the intersection of law and politics. It wasn't until we moved to her study for coffee that she addressed the elephant in the room. "I've been watching your career for several years now," she said, settling into a wingback chair beside a crackling fireplace. "Your prosecution of the Hartford corruption case first caught my attention. The way you built that case, despite political pressure, it reminded me of my own early career." "Thank you, Justice Hamilton. That means more than you know. Please call me Margaret. We're going to be colleagues soon, and if my instincts are correct, we may be working together more closely than either of us initially expected." She paused, studying my face with the analytical gaze that had dissected thousands of legal arguments over the years. "Penelope, I'm retiring in 18 months, not 2 years, as has been publicly announced. The governor knows this, but we've kept the timeline confidential to avoid the political circus that inevitably surrounds succession discussions." My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. 18 months? The question is whether you'll be ready. An appellate court appointment is significant, but Chief Justice requires a different set of skills entirely. You'd be leading a court of 7 justices, managing a budget of $40 million, and serving as the public face of the state's entire judicial system. I set down my coffee, my mind racing through the implications. Chief Justice in less than 2 years. It was ambitious beyond anything I'd dared to plan. What would I need to do to be considered? Margaret smiled, and I caught a glimpse of the strategic mind that had shaped decades of legal precedent. You'd need to prove that you can handle the politics without compromising the law. The recent attacks on your appointment were a test, and you passed with flying colors. But the real challenges will come once you're on the court. She stood and walked to her desk, retrieving a thick folder marked "Confidential." "There are 3 cases coming before the court next year that will define the next decade of jurisprudence in this state: environmental regulations, campaign finance reform, and reproductive rights. The decisions we make will either advance justice or set it back by a generation." Margaret handed me the folder. "I want you to review these cases, study the legal precedents, and prepare position papers on each one. Not for publication, for your own understanding of the complexity involved in leading a court through contentious political terrain." I accepted the folder, feeling its weight both literally and figuratively. "Are you asking me to audition for your position?" "I'm asking you to prepare for it. The governor will make the final decision, but my recommendation carries significant weight. I want to know that my successor shares my commitment to justice over politics, to protecting the vulnerable over appeasing the powerful." As I prepared to leave, Margaret walked me to the door, her expression more serious than it had been all evening. "Penelope, there's something else you need to understand. The forces that opposed your appellate appointment will multiply tenfold if you're under consideration for Chief Justice. They'll dig deeper, attack harder, and use every resource at their disposal to prevent someone with your background and principles from gaining that level of power. I've survived their attacks before. Yes, but next time they won't limit themselves to newspaper articles and whisper campaigns. They'll come after your cases, your relationships, anything they can use to disqualify you. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" I thought about Vivienne, lying in her hospital bed, finally understanding the cost of choosing fear over courage. I thought about Maria Santos, safe from her abuser because someone had been willing to fight for her. I thought about all the people who needed advocates in the highest levels of government, who deserved judges who remembered what powerlessness felt like. "Yes," I said simply, "I'm prepared." The drive home gave me time to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Chief Justice, the position that would make me the most powerful judge in the state, with influence reaching far beyond Millbrook County. It was everything I'd dreamed of, and more than I'd ever dared to plan for. But it was Margaret's warning about increased opposition that stayed with me as I parked outside my downtown condo. They would come harder next time, dig deeper, attack more viciously. I needed to be ready not just professionally, but personally. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even myself. Instead of going directly to my office, I drove to Millbrook General Hospital. Vivienne was in physical therapy when I arrived, working with a trainer to regain strength in her left arm. She looked stronger than she had in weeks, though the effort required for each movement was clearly exhausting. When she saw me in the doorway, she paused her exercises. "Penelope, I wasn't expecting you today. We need to talk, privately." 20 minutes later, we were alone in her room, the door closed against the constant bustle of hospital activity. Vivienne sat in the chair beside her bed, still wearing her therapy clothes, studying my face with renewed alertness. "Something's happened," she said. It wasn't a question. "Justice Hamilton is retiring in 18 months. She's considering recommending me as her replacement." The silence that followed was profound. Vivienne's eyes widened, and I watched her absorb the full implications of what I'd just told her. "Chief Justice," she whispered. "You could be Chief Justice." "I could be, but it won't be easy. The opposition to my appellate appointment will look like a friendly disagreement compared to what's coming." Vivienne nodded slowly, her political instincts still sharp despite her physical limitations. "They'll try to destroy you." "Yes, and this time they might succeed if I don't handle it perfectly." I leaned forward, making sure she understood the gravity of what I was about to say. "Vivienne, I need to know, are we done fighting each other? Because if there's any part of you that still wants to see me fail, now would be the time to act on it." She was quiet for so long I wondered if she'd understood the question. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Penelope, 12 years ago I tried to destroy you because I was afraid you'd expose what I really was. Now you're offering to trust me with information that could end your career if I chose to use it against you. That's exactly what I'm doing." "Why?" I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where I'd built my career case by case, victory by victory. "Because I've learned something that you forgot somewhere along the way. Real power doesn't come from tearing others down. It comes from lifting yourself up so high that their attacks can't reach you." When I turned back, Vivienne was crying again, but this time they weren't tears of self-pity or regret. They were tears of recognition, of finally understanding the difference between the woman she'd become and the woman she could have been. "You have my word," she said quietly, "not just my silence, but my support. If anyone comes to me looking for ammunition against you, they'll find themselves talking to someone who remembers what it means to believe in justice." As I left the hospital that afternoon, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The war between Vivienne and me was truly over, and for the first time since I'd learned about Margaret's retirement, I allowed myself to believe that I might actually have a chance at the position that would change everything. But first, I had 18 months to prove myself worthy of it. 18 months to navigate the treacherous waters of judicial politics while maintaining the principles that had brought me this far. The real test was just beginning. 15 months later, the call I'd been expecting finally came. Governor Langston's voice was crisp and official when she reached me at my chambers in the appellate courthouse. "Judge Rivers, I need you in my office at 4 o'clock today. I'm announcing my choice for Chief Justice tomorrow morning, and we need to discuss the transition timeline." I hung up the phone with hands that barely trembled. A far cry from the woman who'd once shaken like a leaf in Vivienne's dining room. My year on the appellate court had been transformational, not just for my legal career, but for my understanding of power and how to wield it responsibly. I'd written opinions that protected workers' rights, strengthened environmental protections, and expanded access to justice for low-income families. Each decision had been carefully crafted to build a record that would support a Chief Justice nomination. But it was the case that had concluded just 2 weeks earlier that I knew had sealed my appointment. Riverside Development Corporation versus the state of Millbrook had been the most politically sensitive case to come before our court in decades. The company, owned by several prominent families, including the Worthingtons and the Blackwoods, had challenged new environmental regulations that would cost them millions in development projects. The case had drawn national attention and enormous political pressure. During oral arguments, I'd recognize some faces in the gallery: former colleagues from the DA's office, reporters, and several members of Millbrook's social elite who'd spent years dismissing me as an outsider. But it was the woman in the back row who'd captured my attention. Vivienne, who'd been released from the rehabilitation hospital 6 months earlier and was walking with only a slight limp. She'd kept her promise. Over the past year, whenever whispers started about my qualifications or background, Vivienne had been quietly countering them in the social circles that mattered. Not defending me publicly, that would have been obvious and potentially damaging, but simply refusing to participate in the character assassination campaigns that periodically bubbled up around my name. The Riverside case had been my moment to prove that I could make difficult decisions without regard to political consequences. The company's lawyers had presented compelling economic arguments about job losses and reduced tax revenue. The political pressure had been immense. Even Governor Langston had privately expressed concerns about the potential backlash. But the law was clear, and I'd written the majority opinion upholding the environmental regulations. The decision had cost several powerful families millions of dollars and earned me enemies in the state's business community. It had also demonstrated that I couldn't be intimidated or bought, which was exactly the message Margaret Hamilton had told me I needed to send. As I drove to the governor's office that afternoon, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From that humiliating graduation dinner to this car ride that would determine my future, every step had been building toward this confrontation, not with Vivienne anymore, but with the system that had tried to keep me in my place. Governor Langston's office occupied the entire top floor of the state capitol building, with panoramic views of Millbrook stretching out below. When I arrived, she was standing at the windows, her back to the door, studying the city we'd both dedicated our careers to serving. "Judge Rivers, thank you for coming." She turned, and I could see the weight of the decision in her expression. "Please, have a seat." I settled into one of the leather chairs facing her desk, my hands folded calmly in my lap. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. "I'm going to be direct," Governor Langston said, sitting across from me. "You're my choice for Chief Justice. Margaret Hamilton has given you her strongest possible recommendation. Your record on the appellate court has been exemplary, and the legal community overwhelmingly supports your appointment." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by a surge of anticipation. "Thank you, Governor. I'm honored by your confidence." "However," she continued, and I felt my stomach tighten, "the confirmation process is going to be brutal. The opposition has been organizing for months, and they're planning to throw everything they have at you. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" I thought about Maria Santos, about the women I'd helped escape abusive situations, about the corruption cases I'd prosecuted despite political pressure. "Governor, I've been preparing for this my entire career." "Good, because tomorrow morning when I announce your nomination, the real battle begins. Your confirmation hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks from today. That's 6 weeks for them to find anything they can use against you." After leaving the governor's office, I did something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. I drove to Rosewood Heights, to the mansion that had once intimidated me beyond measure, and knocked on Vivienne's door. She answered wearing a simple cardigan and slacks, her silver hair styled less formally than in the old days. The stroke had changed her physically, but more than that, it had changed her perspective. The woman who opened the door was someone I was still learning to recognize, Vivienne without the armor of artificial superiority. "Penelope?" she said, genuine pleasure in her voice. "This is a surprise. Come in." The mansion's interior was different, too. Gone were many of the ostentatious displays of wealth. replaced by comfortable furniture and family photographs that included pictures I'd never seen before. Vivienne as a young woman, laughing with friends, looking genuinely happy. "I have news," I said as we settled in her living room. "Governor Langston nominated me for Chief Justice today. The announcement is tomorrow morning." Vivienne's face lit up with an expression I'd never seen directed at me before. Pure, uncomplicated pride. "Penelope, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." The words hit me with unexpected force. For over a decade, I'd told myself that her approval didn't matter, that I'd moved beyond needing validation from the woman who'd once tried to destroy me. But hearing those words now, "I'm so proud of you," spoken with genuine warmth, I realized how much I'd needed to hear them. "There's going to be opposition," I continued. "Serious opposition. People are going to try to destroy my reputation, my character, anything they can find to disqualify me." Vivienne's expression grew serious. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to understand that some of that opposition might come from your old friends, people you've known for years. They might try to use you to get to me." "Let them try." Her voice carried a steel I recognized from the old days, but this time it was deployed in my defense rather than against me. "Penelope, I spent 30 years building relationships in this community. I know where all the bodies are buried, whose business practices don't bear scrutiny, whose charity work is really about tax avoidance. If anyone wants to come after you through me, they'll discover that it's a very dangerous game to play." I studied her face, seeing not the desperate social climber who'd once felt threatened by my success, but a woman who'd found peace with her own story and was ready to use her knowledge and connections for something meaningful. "There's something else," I said quietly. "When I'm confirmed, not if, when, I'm going to be in a position to influence policy, to shape how justice is administered in this state. I want to make sure that people like me, people who come from nothing, have the same opportunities I did. But I also want to make sure that people like you, people who've made mistakes but want to do better, get second chances." Vivienne's eyes filled with tears. "You're offering me redemption. I'm offering you the chance to be the person you should have been all along, the person you were before fear made you cruel." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her processing not just my words but the full journey that had brought us to this conversation. Two women who'd been enemies, now sitting in the same room where she'd once humiliated me, planning how to build a more just future together. "I accept," she said finally. "Not because I deserve it, but because I want to earn it." As I drove home that evening, I thought about the confrontation that was really happening here. Not the public battle over my confirmation. That would be fought in hearing rooms and newspaper editorials. The real confrontation was with everything that had tried to keep me small. The poverty I'd been born into. The class barriers I'd had to overcome. The social systems designed to perpetuate inequality. Tomorrow morning, Governor Langston would announce that a woman who'd been called the Help 12 years earlier was now nominated to be the most powerful judge in the state. The girl from nowhere would be one confirmation hearing away from a position that could reshape the legal landscape for generations. But tonight, I allowed myself to savor this moment, sitting in my car outside the mansion where my journey had really begun, knowing that the woman inside was no longer my enemy but my ally, and that everything I'd fought for was finally within reach. The real confrontation had been with my own limitations, my own fears, my own willingness to accept other people's definitions of what I could become, and I had won. The confirmation hearing took place on a crisp November morning in the state Senate chamber, with every seat filled and cameras rolling for live television coverage. I sat at the witness table in my navy blue suit, the same color I'd worn to that first charity auction, but this time the fabric was expensive, perfectly tailored, and worn by a woman who belonged exactly where she was sitting. Behind me in the gallery, I could see faces that told the story of my journey. Rebecca sat in the front row, having taken time off from the hospital to be there. Eleanor Hartwell, now retired but still sharp as ever, had made the trip from her new home in Florida. Maria Santos was there too, the woman whose case had been my first victory, now remarried and thriving as a victim's advocate. But it was the figure in the third row that drew the most attention from the assembled reporters and political observers. Vivienne Ashworth, dressed elegantly in charcoal gray, sat with perfect posture despite her lingering physical limitations. Her presence was a statement that reverberated through the chamber. If the woman who'd once been my greatest enemy was here to support me, what did that say about my character? Senator Caroline Blackwood called the hearing to order, her voice echoing in the ornate chamber. We're here today to consider the nomination of Judge Penelope Rivers to serve as Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. Judge Rivers, please raise your right hand. The oath was familiar. I'd taken it when I became a prosecutor, again when I joined the appellate court. But this version felt different, weighted with the knowledge that this might be the last time I'd be sworn in to anything. Chief Justice was the pinnacle, the position I'd dreamed of since that moment in Margaret Hamilton's study. The questioning began gently. Senator Blackwood and her Democratic colleagues lobbed softballs about my judicial philosophy, my vision for the court's future, my commitment to impartial justice. I answered confidently, drawing on months of preparation and years of experience. But I knew the real test would come from the Republican members of the committee, led by Senator Robert Thornton, a man whose family had been part of Millbrook's elite for 4 generations, and who'd never hidden his disdain for what he called judicial activism. Judge Rivers, Senator Thornton began, his voice carrying the patrician authority of old money, your record shows a concerning pattern of decisions that favor progressive causes over established legal precedent. How can we trust that you'll interpret the law rather than remake it according to your personal political agenda? I'd been expecting this line of attack. Senator, I'd respectfully disagree with your characterization. Every decision I've made has been grounded in careful legal analysis and existing precedent. If you'd like to discuss specific cases, let's do that, he interrupted. Your decision in Riverside Development Corporation versus the state. You ruled against a development project that would have created 1,500 jobs and generated millions in tax revenue. Wasn't that decision based more on your personal environmental beliefs than on legal merit? The chamber fell silent. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, not just in the weeks leading up to the hearing, but in every case I'd decided, every principle I'd refused to compromise. Senator, the Riverside case was decided on a single legal question, whether the State Environmental Protection Act superseded local zoning variances. The statute was clear, the precedent was established, and the company's legal arguments were insufficient to overcome both. My personal beliefs about environmental policy had no bearing on that analysis. But your decision cost this state significant economic development. My decision upheld the rule of law, I said firmly, my voice carrying clearly through the chamber. When judges start deciding cases based on economic considerations rather than legal merit, we've abandoned the principle of equal justice under law. The role of a judge is not to weigh economic benefits, it's to determine what the law requires. Senator Thornton's face reddened slightly. Judge Rivers, isn't it true that your rise through the legal profession has been aided by your willingness to take on high-profile cases that generate favorable media coverage? Some might call that opportunistic careerism. The question was designed to diminish my accomplishments, to suggest that my success was somehow unearned or manipulated. For a moment, I felt an echo of that old uncertainty, the voice that had once whispered that maybe I didn't belong here. Then I looked out at the gallery and saw Maria Santos nodding encouragingly. I saw Eleanor Hartwell's proud smile. I saw Vivienne watching me with complete confidence, as if she'd never doubted that I belonged exactly where I was sitting. Senator, I've prosecuted corruption cases because corruption undermines public trust in government. I've taken domestic violence cases because women like Maria Santos deserve protection under the law. I've written opinions defending workers' rights because justice shouldn't depend on how much money you can afford to spend on lawyers. If standing up for the powerless against the powerful is what you call opportunistic careerism, then I'll wear that label proudly. A murmur of approval rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by Senator Blackwood's gavel. The questioning continued for 3 more hours, covering everything from my judicial philosophy to my personal finances to my views on constitutional interpretation. With each answer, I felt more confident, more certain that I belonged in this room, that I'd earned the right to seek this position through merit rather than connections. The final question came from Senator Patricia Mills, a moderate Republican who'd been silent through most of the hearing. Judge Rivers, if confirmed, you'll be the youngest Chief Justice in this state's history and the first from a working-class background. What would you say to those who argue that you lack the breadth of experience typically expected in this role? I paused, thinking about the journey that had brought me here, from that train platform where a 10-year-old girl had been abandoned, to this chamber where I was being considered for the highest judicial position in the state. Senator, I'd say that experience comes in many forms. I may not have the traditional background of inherited wealth or Ivy League connections, but I have something equally valuable. I understand what it feels like to need the protection of the law. I've seen how justice can transform lives, how a fair hearing before an impartial judge can mean the difference between safety and danger, between hope and despair. I glanced toward the gallery, my eyes briefly meeting Vivienne's. I've also learned that real leadership isn't about maintaining the status quo. It's about having the courage to ensure that the promise of equal justice extends to everyone, regardless of their background or circumstances. That's the kind of Chief Justice I intend to be. The hearing concluded with closing statements from committee members, but I barely heard them. My attention was focused on the knowledge that I'd done everything I could, said everything that needed to be said. As the chamber emptied, people approached to offer congratulations and support. Former colleagues, civil rights attorneys, bar association leaders, all expressing confidence that I'd be confirmed. But it was Vivienne who reached me first, moving slowly but steadily through the crowd. "Penelope," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you were magnificent, absolutely magnificent." "Thank you for being here," I replied. "It meant more than you know. I had to be here. I needed to see this moment, needed to witness what you've accomplished." She paused, tears gathering in her eyes. 12 years ago, I tried to convince you that you weren't good enough for my world. Today, I watched you prove that you're too good for anyone's world, that you've created something entirely your own. The vote took place 3 days later. The committee approved my nomination by a margin of 9-4, with 2 Republicans joining the Democratic majority. The full Senate vote was scheduled for the following week, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my downtown condo, looking out at the city lights of Millbrook. Somewhere out there, in a hospital room years earlier, a broken woman had made her first tentative apology. Somewhere out there, in a courthouse that had once intimidated me, Maria Santos had found justice. Somewhere out there, in a mansion that had once seemed unreachable, a former enemy had become an unlikely ally. The ripple effects of this day would extend far beyond my own life. As Chief Justice, I'd have the power to shape legal precedent for decades, to ensure that the courts remained accessible to people like the person I'd once been. The girl who'd been dismissed as the help was about to become the person who helped redefine what justice looked like in the 21st century. But for tonight, I was content to stand in the quiet evening air, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders and knowing, finally, that I was strong enough to carry it. 3 months after my confirmation as Chief Justice, I received an invitation that brought my journey full circle. The annual Millbrook Medical Foundation Gala, the same charity circuit where Vivienne had once reigned supreme, was honoring me as their keynote speaker. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all me. The invitation had come through Vivienne, who'd been elected to the foundation's board after her recovery. Her note was simple. They need to hear from someone who understands the true meaning of service. Will you help me give them that gift? I accepted not for the recognition, but because it represented something profound, the complete transformation of a space that had once been used to diminish me into a platform for inspiring others. The evening of the gala, I stood before my bedroom mirror, adjusting the simple black dress I'd chosen for the occasion. Around my neck, I wore a single piece of jewelry, a delicate gold chain with a small pendant, a gift from Maria Santos on the day of my swearing-in ceremony. For the woman who saved my life, the accompanying note had read, so she never forgets that justice is personal. The Rosewood Heights Country Club looked exactly as I remembered from that painful evening 12 years earlier. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over elegantly dressed guests, waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvre, and the soft murmur of polite conversation filled the air. But this time I walked through those doors as the guest of honor, accompanied by Rebecca and my new husband, Dr. James Caldwell, a surgeon I'd met during one of my hospital visits to Vivienne, whose quiet strength and unwavering integrity had slowly won my guarded heart. The crowd parted as we entered, and I felt the weight of their attention. Some faces were familiar from my confirmation hearing, others from court proceedings I'd overseen, but many were new, younger professionals, community activists, people whose presence at this exclusive venue represented the changing face of Millbrook's power structure. Vivienne approached us near the entrance, moving with the careful grace she'd maintained since her stroke. She looked elegant in deep blue silk, her silver hair arranged in a style that suited her face better than the rigid perfection of her earlier years. But it was the warmth in her eyes, genuine, unguarded, that marked the real change. "Chief Justice Rivers," she said formally, then broke into a smile. "Penelope, thank you for coming. Thank you for asking, though I have to admit, the last time I was in this room, the experience was memorable." Vivienne's expression grew serious. "That's exactly why we need you here tonight. This room, these people, they need to understand that leadership isn't about maintaining privilege. It's about using whatever platform you have to lift others up." The dinner proceeded with the usual charitable presentations and recognition ceremonies. I found myself seated at the head table between Dr. Harrison Webb, the Foundation's medical director, and Judge Patricia Morrison, my former colleague from the appellate court. The conversation was warm, respectful, and completely different from that painful evening 12 years earlier when I'd been dismissed and forgotten. When Vivienne rose to introduce me, the room fell silent with an attention that felt different from polite obligation. There was genuine interest, even anticipation, as she approached the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have the honor of hearing from someone who embodies everything this foundation stands for: service, perseverance, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves dignity and justice." She paused, her eyes finding mine across the room. But our speaker's journey to this podium wasn't easy. 12 years ago, in this very room, she faced dismissal and condescension from people who couldn't see past their own limited definitions of worth and potential. A ripple of uncomfortable awareness moved through the audience. Some shifted in their seats, perhaps remembering their own moments of prejudice or exclusion. "I know this," Vivienne continued, her voice growing stronger, "because I was one of those people. I allowed fear and insecurity to make me cruel to someone who deserved nothing but support and encouragement. Tonight, I have the privilege of introducing the woman I tried to diminish, who rose above my cruelty to become not just our state's Chief Justice, but a beacon of hope for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong." The applause that followed was thunderous, but I barely heard it. I was watching Vivienne's face, seeing the peace that came from finally telling the complete truth, from acknowledging her failures as clearly as she celebrated my success. When I reached the podium, I looked out at the sea of faces, some guilt-ridden, others curious, many genuinely moved by Vivienne's introduction. I thought about the scared young woman who'd once stood in this room holding dirty dishes, and the journey that had brought me back here as Chief Justice. "Thank you, Vivienne, for that introduction, and for the courage it took to speak those words." I paused, letting my eyes sweep the room. 12 years ago, many of you witnessed a moment that changed my life, not because of the cruelty I experienced, but because of the choice it forced me to make. I found Rebecca in the audience, her encouraging smile giving me strength. I could have chosen bitterness. I could have decided that a system that allowed such treatment wasn't worth fighting for. Instead, I chose to prove that worth isn't determined by background or connections. It's earned through service, integrity, and the refusal to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. The room was completely silent now, every face turned toward me with full attention. As Chief Justice, I've had the privilege of overseeing cases that protect workers' rights, defend environmental protections, and ensure that domestic violence victims receive the justice they deserve. Each decision has been guided by a simple principle: the law must work for everyone, not just those with the resources to make it work for them. I paused, thinking about Maria Santos, about Eleanor Hartwell, about every person who'd believed in me when belief seemed impossible. But tonight I want to talk about something else: the power of redemption and second chances. The woman who introduced me tonight was once my greatest adversary. She could have remained my enemy, could have continued to work against my success. Instead, she chose growth over pride, courage over fear. That transformation gives me hope that we can all choose to be better than our worst moments. Looking directly at Vivienne, I continued. In my role as Chief Justice, I see the law's capacity not just to punish wrongdoing, but to provide opportunities for people to change, to contribute, to become who they were meant to be. That's what true justice looks like. Not just accountability, but the possibility of redemption. The speech continued for another 10 minutes, covering the Foundation's important work and the role of civic engagement in building stronger communities. But it was the personal story, the transformation of enemies into allies, the possibility of healing old wounds, that resonated most powerfully with the audience. As the evening concluded, people approached to share their own stories of overcoming obstacles, of learning to see past their prejudices, of finding the courage to stand up for what's right. A young lawyer thanked me for showing her that success didn't require abandoning her principles. A retired judge admitted that my confirmation hearing had forced him to examine his own biases. A medical student whose family had immigrated from Somalia told me that seeing me as Chief Justice had given her the confidence to pursue her dreams despite facing discrimination. But it was the conversation with Nathaniel that caught me most off guard. My ex-husband appeared as I was preparing to leave, looking healthier than I'd seen him in years, his eyes clear and focused. "Penelope," he said, extending his hand formally, "congratulations on everything you've achieved. I owe you an apology, several apologies actually." "Nathaniel, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. I failed you when we were married. I chose my mother's approval over your dignity, chose comfort over courage. I've spent the last few years in recovery, not just from addiction, but from the cowardice that defined too much of my life." He glanced toward Vivienne, who was saying goodbye to other guests across the room. "She's different now. We both are. The stroke changed her, but watching your success, seeing who you became despite how we treated you, that changed her even more. She talks about you with such pride, such admiration. I think helping you succeed has become her way of atoning for trying to tear you down." "And what about you?" I asked gently. "I'm learning to be proud of who I really am instead of trying to live up to expectations that were never really mine. It's harder than I expected, but watching you has shown me that it's possible." As James and I drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, I reflected on the evening and the strange symmetry of returning to the place where my transformation had begun. The scared young woman who'd once been dismissed as the help had returned as Chief Justice, but, more importantly, she'd returned as someone who understood that true power came not from conquering enemies, but from inspiring them to become better. "Penny for your thoughts," James said, using the nickname that still made me smile. "I was thinking about second chances," I replied. "About how the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to let other people's limitations become our own." "Is that what you did with Vivienne?" "I think that's what we did for each other." She needed to learn that real strength comes from lifting others up, and I needed to learn that forgiveness isn't about excusing the past. It's about refusing to let the past define the future. We pulled into our driveway, a modest home in a quiet neighborhood that felt more luxurious than any mansion because it was built on love and mutual respect rather than performance and fear. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, the same action I'd taken 12 years earlier in that cramped apartment, but now performed by a woman who'd learned to see herself clearly. The Chief Justice looking back at me had gray threads in her dark hair, lines around her eyes from years of difficult decisions, and a quiet confidence that no one could ever take away. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to ensure that justice remained accessible to everyone who needed it. But tonight, I was content to know that the frightened young woman who'd once been told she wasn't good enough had not only proven them wrong, she'd shown them what good enough really looked like. The girl they'd called the Help had become the woman who helped others find their own path to justice. And that transformation, I realized, was the most powerful victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.